We are in the midst of a paradigm change in biology. I believe the emerging scientific theories and psychotechnologies are going to radically reorganize how we understand ourselves, consider what health is, and crucially, for my own purposes, allow us to really understand the nature of pain and address it. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Pain Points, where we explore the intersection between pain and insight. My name is Max Shen. I used to be a machine learning researcher, but I pivoted to studying pain and cognition after a debilitating experience with chronic pain during my graduate degree. I now use computational tools to study chronic pain at MIT. This episode is about establishing a worldview from which we can understand why we're so troubled with pain and other medical challenges today, and what the future looks like. By the end of this episode, you'll have a new lens on the shifting terrain in biology, health, and cognitive science. Hopefully a taste of excitement for this coming change. If you yourself are experiencing chronic pain, my hope is that you'll find this useful as a way of making sense of many of the mysterious aspects of pain. I'll begin with the old paradigm, the biomedical paradigm of understanding humans and organisms. I'll then go on to the emerging science of biological computation as exemplified by the work of Michael Levin at Tufts and Karl Friston at the University of College London. Then I'll go and talk about the psychotechnologies, the somatic practices that came about in the mid-20th century that I see as really promising for the treatment of pain. So let's start with the old paradigm, the biomedical paradigm. So the biomedical paradigm rests on three tenets. The first is materialism, the second is reductionism, and the third is dualism. Materialism is the idea that we are bones and flesh, cells, chemicals. That's fundamentally what we are. There isn't more to it. We are collections of chemicals and atoms moving around, rearranging themselves. Reductionism is the idea that us larger things can be understood in terms of the smaller components. If you've heard of the central dogma of biology, DNA becomes RNA, becomes proteins, which are the building blocks of cells, which are the building blocks of organisms. So if you really want to understand a human or an organism, you got to go down and really understand the DNA. If we could just model the DNA well enough, we would really understand the organism fully. Sure, there might be some changes over the course of the organism's lifetime, but ultimately things are reducible to DNA. And you see this affecting things outside of molecular biology too. There's this perspective that if we are moving poorly, for example, we need to look at the specific muscle that isn't functioning right and strengthen or repair it. So broadly, this idea that large level things can be understood in terms of the interactions of the small level things, that's materialism. And dualism is this notion that we are separate from the world, and I'll say also that we are passive receivers of our environment. The basic idea is that we are in here, there's a skin border, and we, or you, is supposedly something inside your head somewhere. And then there's this world out there. And basically the world out there happens and we receive information and our mind filters it. And we basically see things, but through some kind of distorted lens. But fundamentally, it's kind of like a camera. We're just seeing what's there. We might not be seeing very well, but that's dualism. So those, you can roughly say, are some of the foundations of the biomedical worldview. And it should have been familiar, it certainly was to me as an undergraduate studying biology. If you're curious to understand more about this, you can look at the section on medical history in the textbook, The Great Psychotherapy Debate. It actually has a great discussion of this. To make it a little bit more concrete, let's talk about the example of pain, how pain is usually explained. So if you open a typical neuroscience textbook, you'll probably see a diagram that goes like this. The finger touching a sharp object causes the nociceptors, the pain receptors in your fingers, to fire A delta or C fibers, and that sends information along the nerve, up along around the dorsal horn in your spine, and then projects up to some part of your brain, some regions of maybe the somatosensory cortex or the amygdala. And that is what pain is. It's what's implied. You have some input from the environment and your brain registers it as pain. The problem with materialism, reductionism, dualism, and that example of pain is that it's not right. It's clearly unhelpful for many different examples to think this way. We can first talk about, in general, how materialism is obviously wrong. So, for one, our brain uses electrical signals. Those are not atoms. You'll have heard of brain waves. And brain waves are not chemicals or hormones. They're patterns of electrical activity around your head. We know that cells communicate using electrical signals. And we also know, thanks to some of the work of Mike Levin, that these signals hold memories too. And once you acknowledge that, the importance of electrical signaling, it's no longer just atoms and materials. And then you start to understand the interactions across the whole organism. And that brings us to reductionism, why reductionism is also obviously false. So there's a lot of things to say about this, but to keep it relatively simple, just notice how your body responds to the environment. It's obviously not the case that we are purely determined by our DNA. Social and cultural factors are a thing. If you have identical twins, and one lives in China and one lives in the US, they're going to grow up differently because of the culture and the environment that they're in. I'll give you two more examples. Say you're trying to understand a chess game. Imagine trying to understand Garry Kasparov making a chess move in terms of his DNA. What cells would you take to understand the next move he's making? Sure, you could look at some of the concentration of cortisol in his brain, and sure, you can sequence his DNA, but good luck figuring out what next move he'll make. It's also ridiculous to think that you can model that in terms of the physics there. Obviously, there's another lens that is helpful for understanding a chess game, or language, or any of these other human activities. One more example against reductionism. To be a little bit more specific, Dennis Noble, this Oxford biologist, has a great paper called Towards Biological Relativity. And he looks at the pacemaker cells inside the heart. So these are the cells that are responsible for your regular heart rate rhythm. And how these cells roughly work is that there's a sodium channel and a potassium channel. And these channels, the sodium and the potassium channel, are proteins embedded in the cell membrane. But these proteins don't know when to open or close. They open in response to the voltage across the cell membrane. And of course, the voltage of the cell membrane is a property of the cell itself, a higher level construct than the protein. And so the pacemaker cell keeps beat by the sodium channel opening at one point and then the voltage changes of the whole cell, and then that voltage change causes the potassium channels to open. So there's constantly this influx and outflow of ions that create this regular beating. But what's happening here, you'll notice, is that there's both causation from the bottom up. The protein opening causes the cell voltage to change, but also from the top down, the cell voltage also influences the opening of each protein membrane. So the basic idea with that is that higher level things are influencing lower level things at the same time as the lower level things are influencing higher level things. So we can't just think purely in terms of reduction. Okay, now what about dualism? This idea that we are in here and passively receiving our experience. That is a huge can of worms. Okay, so for dualism, this idea that we are in here passively receiving our environment that is out there, it's a huge worldview to start to poke at, but I'll just give an example or two. So if you've ever seen an optical illusion, a persistent optical illusion, you'll get a little hint of it. Go on the internet and look at a Ponzo illusion. The Italian psychologist collected a bunch of these examples, but just look at some optical illusion that persists even as you see it. Maybe you've seen this example of the old woman and the young woman, where you can see both depending on your perspective. If you Google Ponzo bus illusion, you'll see this example of two buses that have the same number of pixels, but along a road, one bus would consistently look larger than the other. And there's also auditory hallucinations. Anil Seth has a great TED talk where he gives a really visceral example of this. The point is, when you start to look and ask what's happening in the cases of these optical illusions, you'll see we're not just passively receiving things, we're actually generating our experience. So when it comes to pain, this is a huge issue because the biomedical assumption is that we are passive receivers of our experience. So if we have pain, that is generally a sign that we have tissue damage. But researchers have observed cases, many, many cases, where there is both severe damage and no pain, and also severe pain and no damage. So in the cases of severe damage and no pain, you can look at Henry Beach, the Harvard doctor who's on the Anzio beachhead, this war front in Italy in World War II, where he found that all of these soldiers with these horrendous injuries didn't want any morphine. They reported very little pain. And informally, we've all experienced waking up with some bruise or cut, maybe from a soccer match or a race. So there we had damage, but no perception of it. On the other side, there's also lots of cases of pain, but no damage. We've known about phantom limb pain for many, many decades, where people whose limbs have been amputated report pain in the missing limb. So this is not at the stump. It's actually really gruesome detail, but if you read any of these anecdotes, you'll hear they still feel the ring finger on their left hand being crushed by the truck, even though their whole arm is gone. It's very vivid to them. And if you think it's just at the stump, just take a look at some of these explanations and you'll see there. In the case of phantom limb pain, there is no longer damage. They've had some cases 10, 20 years to recover, but still this pain in the missing limb. And most cases of chronic lower back pain, especially the chronic non-specific lower back pain, are similar. That's why there are methodologies that don't involve any tissue or structural changes, that instead work with the nervous system, that can permanently relieve back pain. If you're curious about this, there's a great paper by Yoni Ashar, 2022, Pain Reprocessing Therapy. So the biomedical perspective doesn't work. Humans are not just material. They can't be fully reduced to their cells, to DNA, and they aren't just passive receivers of input. What's the next frontier? I mentioned biological computation before. It's not really actually a single paradigm yet. And you might hear different names like collective intelligence, active inference, multi-scale computation that refer to a similar cluster of ideas. I'll highlight 3 ideas that I think are really interesting and important here. The first is that of surprise minimization via action and perception changes. This is really core within the framework of active inference. So a core claim that Friston makes with his free energy principle model is that all living systems are working to minimize prediction error. And that is, for them, the difference between their internal model of the world and that is for them the difference between the expected and the actual sensory inputs that they have. Surprise here is roughly the same as free energy, though there's some important caveats here. I don't want to get too hung up on the technicals of the term. I'll just give an example so that there's some kind of lay intuition. So think of a kid learning how to play baseball. Initially, the kid has large prediction errors as their internal model fails to capture the trajectory of the ball. They put their hand here, but the ball is in a different place and they miss. But as they learn, there are 2 general processes that are happening here in the perspective of this action minimizing surprise. The first is that the kid is updating their internal model to better predicting the flight paths of the ball based off of how the ball is traveling and how the thrower throws it. The second is that they are repositioning their body in response to their predictions and new data coming in so that they better catch the ball. An expert catcher can demonstrate this at a really refined level, making micro adjustments based off of subtle cues, sometimes even before the ball leaves the hand of the thrower. This idea is really an elaboration, in a way, of some of the breakthroughs of cybernetics in the late 40s and early 50s. And what's interesting about this? So before this, everyone was thinking in terms of Newtonian mechanics and linear causation. The main way of reasoning about the world and also organisms was that A causes B and B causes C. So things were like linear billiard balls. So if you knew the initial conditions and you knew the laws that govern them, then you could, in principle, compute everything. This changed when we started to see things like the 3-body problem. We don't have an analytical closed form solution for that, but this was elaborated even better, but this was recognized within cybernetics, the work of Norbert Wiener and other people who saw that there was a causation happening both upwards and down. So A doesn't just cause B, which causes C. A causes B, which sometimes causes C, which then causes A. And so there's this feedback loop. And so the action, perception, and surprise recognizes this feedback loop. And active inference provides a mathematical framework for expressing that at different scales in different organisms. The second idea that I think is really important here is the generative model as the basis of our experience. So in contrast to seeing the world as out there, passively being received by us, this idea of our generative model, also linked to the hypothesis within predictive coding, predictive processing, says that we are actually generating our own experience. So the voice that you're hearing right now it's not just a direct product of the vibrations in your ear. There's actually active work being done for you to generate the sound experience. This is really clearly mapped out within visual perception. So I mentioned the optical, if you look at the optical illusions again, you'll see that the visual apparatus is making this hallucination that doesn't match what other instruments tell us about the lengths of lines or the relative sizes of buses in the case of the Ponzo illusion. Also, if you just look at the shape of the retina and you pay close attention to how your eyes move on a page, it's jumping all over the place. Yet somehow the image feels stable and still. Where does that stable and stillness come from? How predictive processing people put it is that it's a generated image from the mind. We aren't perceiving reality, we're perceiving our controlled hallucination of reality. The third idea that I think is really interesting and important here is that of nested agency across scales. So you tend to think of a human being as a distinct whole thing. You're you, and you end at your skin, right? But clearly you are made of things, and those things are made of things too. One way we can understand ourselves is one way, if we look closely, those things, those organs, systems, and cells have their own strategies. And if we look closely at those things, those organs, organ systems, or cells, they have their own goals and their strategies. Another way of putting this is we are a nested hierarchy of different selves or agents, whatever you want to call them, that are trying to do their own thing. So at the level of the whole organism, I might be hungry, so I'm going to solve the problem of finding food, rearranging my body, putting it in my mouth and chewing it, digesting it. That's the whole organism goal and the strategies I have available to me. If we go down one level, we have organ systems. So one example is the vestibular system, which is responsible for the sense of balance. The vestibular system, if I'm leaning back, has as input to it the inner ear, which senses that I might be just falling outside my center of balance. And there's this automatic correction. There's this problem-solving tendency to bring myself back into balance. If we go down the level of that, to the level of the organs, your liver is solving problems. It has many different goals, but for example, it might be trying to convert glucose into glycogen to then store energy in your body. Go down even another level to the level of individual cells, and they have their own goals too. Your liver cell might, in the process of dividing, undergoing mitosis, have to unfurl the DNA from the nucleus, bring in the DNA polymerase and all these enzymes that help with the replication. So all of these agents, these little selves that are nested, have their own goals, but we can also say that they're united in a way, and they share the goal of keeping this whole thing alive. They share the story of this big self that you are. So why is all of this so interesting? Well, one way of putting it is that biology and most of medical science is like computer science, but in the mid-1940s. Everything is about hardware and mechanism. We haven't figured out software yet. We haven't figured out feedback loops yet. These ideas are a way of porting the insights we've had from cybernetics and computer science and those types of engineering advancements into biology and medical science. It solves many of the issues that I had pointed out before. about materialism by understanding and foregrounding cognition. It solves the issues brought about by these assumptions of materialism, of reductionism, and of this passive dualism. We are active participants, and we are collective intelligences. Each one bit of us is trying to solve and computing in a beautiful orchestra. And my goals influence my gut bacteria's goals, and my gut bacteria's goals influence my goals. But I can get a little bit more specific about that. In the context of health and pain, it gives us more levers to make progress. So let's talk about health to begin with. The typical way that health is operationalized in the biomedical perspective is deviation from a statistical norm. Is your blood pressure above or below a healthy reference point? But what if your whole population is unhealthy? The second way it's operationalized is the absence of disorders. Do you have some cluster of symptoms that some experts have somehow decided to call bad? If you don't, then you are, for all intents and purposes, healthy. Now, I'll note that this disorder perspective is a natural consequence of if you understand humans as complex biological machines, where with an analog machine like a clock, if it's not functional, you look for the part that's broken and you replace it. A lot of surgery takes the same perspective. Instead, what if we understood health as something more like problem-solving ability? And problem-solving ability across different scales and different spaces. So maybe health could be both my ability to pursue my dreams of doing handstands on a beach, but also my vestibular system's ability to keep me upright even as I'm balancing a block of wood on one foot, but also my immune system's ability to fight off foreign invaders, but also my liver cells' ability to replicate without becoming cancerous. That view sees health as this type of agency, this capacity to respond to problems, to solve problems. This is actually a perspective that I write about in a recent preprint called Beyond Biomechanics, the Inactive Inference Approach to Health and Movement. So under that perspective, we would take very different approaches to exercise and movement and to understanding what health is about. Maybe our healthcare system could be about enablement rather than the prevention of dis-ease. The second thing that I think this perspective is really helpful for is pain. So the medical community has long had the critique of the biomedical perspective put forth. Even in the 1950s, Henry Beecher, this Harvard doctor, saw that there were biological, psychological, and social influences on pain. That's why these soldiers with bullets lodged in their chests might not feel any pain. The problem was that there wasn't really a language for articulating what was going on. Those spheres were important, but in practice, everything ended up being treated in a very mechanical way. This collective intelligence perspective, this biological computation perspective, I think is much more powerful. With the tools of active inference and this nested agency perspective, I think we can get a lot more specific about what aspects are interacting in pain. We have different layers for understanding the pain experience, from the cell to the organ system, to the organism, to the social level. We can start to articulate these different dimensions that contribute to pain and help address it. And while we're talking about pain as a as part of a generated experience, maybe we can understand we have an active role in the pain experience, that our own interoceptive ability mediates our sense of pain, that working with pain is actually a type of skill. This was the lens that I ended up taking that really helped me, and the lens that I like to take when working with people who have pain. Interoception, this ability to sense what is in your body, changes how you respond to pain. These ideas allow us to get more specific about how improving our own interoception can significantly improve, in some cases completely resolve, our pain. Another thread that I'm incredibly excited about is that of the somatic scientists and the modalities that they've developed. So what I'm calling somatic scientists, this is a term borrowed from Thomas Hanna, the philosopher, are people who, especially around the 1950s to the 1970s, who recognized the limitations of this reductionist biomechanical view and decided to work with the whole human organism, recognizing also the incredible intelligence of the body, the soma. These are people like Rolf or Moshe Feldenkrais, F.M. Alexander, who developed techniques in response to their own bodily pains and problems, and who built communities of practice that garnered a tremendous amount of wisdom. If you cut open a mammal and pull up its skin, you'll notice this white tissue, this webbing that connects its skin to its organs and muscles. It's slimy, and it looks like a spider web. That is fascia. And in the last couple of decades, there's been a resurgence among especially the manual therapists, but in general the physical therapist community, about the importance of fascia. Ida Rolfer, back in the 1950s, saw that there was this interconnection and emphasized the role of fascia in explaining how, for example, your left foot pain might be linked with your right shoulder, because there might be this fascial connection that's separate from this muscular kinetic chain. Moshe Feldenkrais, to give another example, was a physicist engineer. He was actually the chief engineer in the Joly-Curie lab, in France in World War II characterized radioactivity, winning them the Nobel Prize. He was this physicist who transitioned in the second half of his life to developing a modality that allowed people to recover and learn to move despite pains and tensions in their body after he had a very bad incident with his knee. So Feldenkrais in particular studied the role of how our awareness affected how we learned things. Looking at how babies organize themselves to different tasks, he saw this natural bodily intelligence. When our body is put in certain constraints and made to continue to do tasks, repeated tasks, it reorganizes intelligently around that. If you sit hunched all day, your body reorganizes, and eventually after years you develop this forward neck posture, your whole body reorienting itself towards your attention, which in this case might be the computer screen. Feldenkrais saw that if you paid close attention and moved subtly, the body could really quickly learn to move smoothly and gracefully in a way that expanded capacity. The broad reason I'm so excited about the legacy of these somatic scientists, is when I read them, I get the sense that they were on to the same threads, the same insights that drive people like Karl Friston and Mike Levin today. With the writings of Moshe Feldenkrais, for example, you can see him trying to articulate concepts that we didn't have a language for at the time, neuroplasticity, which really became substantiated in the late 90s and 2000s. What dialogue might we have now with scale-free computation and the intelligence of the body contained within these practices? One interesting thing is that often these findings of these somatic scientists are challenged for the lack of evidence. there aren't a bunch of double-blind RCTs that clearly demonstrate their efficacy. But if you take a close look at the design of an RCT, you'll see that the standard of evidence doesn't make sense in the context of a therapy like this. The RCT was developed very specifically in the early to mid 20th century by the FDA for testing drugs. And in this pretty standard biomedical context, it works well enough, but it doesn't work well when there are complex interactions between the therapist and the patient, let alone the protocol that the therapist is apparently following. And this is a big reason why it's been such a mess to try to figure out what psychotherapy is helpful for different people. That's a meta-science problem that I would say is outstanding. We don't have good tools for articulating the differences in efficacy between different therapeutic modalities, whether they be more psychotherapeutic or manually therapeutic, or somewhere in between, as in with the Feldenkrais method. Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, said that scientists doing normal science, that is, clarifying and substantiating an existing paradigm, will predictably challenge those scientists doing revolutionary science who propose a new worldview. Maxwell's equations took decades to become accepted and are now the norm of electromagnetism. And it also happened with Galileo. He was put in house prison for the rest of his life when he proposed that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa. I think this is to some extent what has happened with the somatic scientists, and they've been largely ignored by the academy. Now, with the scale of mental and physical health problems, the WHO, for instance, estimates that there's about 800 million people with lower back pain. I think there's growing appetite for the deep insights developed by somatic scientists and their communities, which are still alive today. And I think those insights can be made so much more precise when put into dialogue with the insights coming through with the collective intelligence research program, with understanding biology as nested agents. Rigor and empiricism is of the utmost importance here. But the tools of today, RCTs, the way that we reason about science, is not enough. And so that's part of the goal of this podcast, Pain Points, is to have a dialogue between the scientists who really understand these ideas around biological computation, multi-scale cognition, and the practitioners who have a clear felt sense of what works and what doesn't. My hope is to help usher in this paradigm change unfolding in biology and human health so that people in pain can heal more quickly and live rich lives. Thank you for listening. Until next time.